The most basic way to neaten off your seams is to use the zigzag function on your machine, okay? And you've probably all tried that, I hope you have. If you haven't, don't worry, I'm going to talk you through each step by step of the process. I'm going to talk you through step by step the process. So basically, why do we need to do this? If we don't neaten our seams, there's a chance that that fabric might fray as you're wearing the garment. So if you've invested time and money in your project and it all falls apart in the wash, you're going to be super heartbroken. So neatening your seams is really good practice. Now in vintage, you might have some vintage clothes and you look inside and they're not neatened. So with a sort of really firm woven cotton, for example, you can sometimes get away without it being neatened. But what will happen over time is it will fray and it will look a little bit raggy on the inside. So neatening, if you can, is a really good thing to do. So if I'm making fancy dress or something that's not going to be worn more than once or twice, I never neaten the seams because it's an extra process for each seam in your construction. But for most things, I will kind of neaten. Now, I'm not going to show you the overlocker today, and I'm not going to show you every type of seam neatening. We're just focusing on using the zigzag and the overcast on our sewing machine. So most of you have probably all got a sewing machine with a zigzag function. If you've got a vintage machine and it doesn't have a zigzag, then I suggest that you maybe use some pinking shears, or you can use a technique called edge stitching. And there are a couple of approaches to doing the zigzag. So I'm going to show you the method that I like to use. Then I'm going to show you the method that's traditionally taught, which I stopped using because I always cut through my threads. And then we're going to have a little look at using an overcast stitch and maybe using an overcast foot. So you probably don't know that your sewing machine is likely to have come with an overcast foot, and there's a good reason why you might want to sometimes use that. Most of the time on modern machines, we just use the standard universal foot because it's got enough space for the zigzag and it means you're not having to swap feet. The downside of that ease is that it doesn't give as great a result as if you swap to the overcast foot. But personally, I just like to charge ahead and get everything done, and I don't want to keep swapping between feet. So if you're a purist, you want to do all your straight stitching with a straight stitch foot and then all your zigzagging with an overcast foot. And then if you are just trying to knock it out of the park, then you just use your universal foot for both. So I hope that that explains the kind of basics. So the first thing I wanted to show you guys is the couple of stitches that we're going to look at. So we're going to take a little look at this diagram from my machine manual. So what we've got all the different stitch selections. So if you want to do a neatening, you're generally going to go for this one. Let me see if I can tilt that a little bit. And that one is your zigzag. These are stretch zigzags, that's for construction, that's not what we want. So we want that one, which on this model is number 8. And then we've got a couple of other things that are sometimes quite useful, like 11. This is an overcast stitch, and it does a stitch very similar to an overlocking. It's very, very slow, and you definitely want to use your overcasting stitch foot for that. So I've got my universal foot on my machine here. So you've probably all got one of these on your machine, and it's got a big hole to allow you to do both straight stitching and zigzag. So this is just for, you know, the ease of using. We can use this for both our straight stitch and our zigzag. But this is an overcast foot. So on the Janome, I think it comes up as a C. And what you've got is a little bit of a blade here, and that runs at the edge of your fabric. And then this little brush sort of keeps everything nice and neat. So this is specifically for overcasting your edges. Now, I usually would just go with my universal foot, but if I was working on, say, a pair of men's wool trousers, it's super light, and you might find when you zigzag you get bumpy bits. Then I would go to my overcasting foot, because from experience I know that using this foot gives a better result on light fabrics than using the universal foot. So I'm just going to pop that back onto the machine. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to take a quick look at our basic zigzag function. All right, so go back onto my sewing machine. So my zigzag, I'm going to select whatever number it is for your machine. Now on my machine, this is a number 8. And then I've got the width. So for standard neatening, I always use the widest. So maybe a 5, I've got 5.5 on this machine. And then your stitch length, this is a computerized machine, so it's setting automatically for 2. So I'm just going to show you what different stitch lengths look like. I think I've trapped my thread in there. Okay, so I'm just going to be zigzagging in the middle of this fabric. I'm not doing any neatening yet. So I've got my needle down to get going. Zigzags tend to really draw the thread back, and it's a good tip just to hold those threads when you get started. And then we're just going to go. So what you can see, the needle is swinging from side to side. So that's why you have to have your universal foot on, like your straight stitch foot. So there's a hole big enough for this swing. And then if I just stop there, what you can see is it's quite a wide stitch. You can already see this is quite a light cotton, it's getting a bit bumpy. And then I'm just going to take that off. Now, it might be, if this is a fine fabric, that I want it closer together and not so wide. So this time I'm going to take the stitch width down to 4, and I'm going to take my stitch length to 1.5. So it's narrower in width and it's shorter in length. Again, I'm just holding onto those tails and dropping my needle before I put my foot on the pedal. Okay, so that's enough of that, just to have a little looky. So what I can see here, I've still got that bit of bumpiness, that's the weight of the fabric, so maybe the overcast stitch would be good, but it's narrower, and can you see that the stitches look more dense? So you just play around with the settings on your machine until you get them how you want them. So I definitely need to look at the tension on this machine. I don't seem to be having much luck with sewing machines. I've got one broken one for tension. We had a jammed one at work, and now this one is a little bit out of sorts. So if I wanted to neaten this raw edge, sometimes patterns will tell you to do the neatening before you construct your seam. Personally, I suggest you always construct your seam and then go ahead and neaten the raw edge, because as you're neatening this edge, I'll show you, I could stretch this out. So if I go all the way around, I'm just using this 1/8 guide here as my guide. I'll talk you through that in a second. But as I'm going around this fabric, there's a good chance that I've started to stretch as I've gone. Whereas if I'm doing this within the seam, it doesn't matter if I stretch it later because the seam has already been constructed, okay? So any fabric that might kind of get bunched up when you are using a zigzag, then the overcast foot would be good. And then basically, I suggest you all go in your cupboards where you've hidden your sewing machine manual, get your manual out, and then have a little play with some of the feet and some of the stitches that the feet go with. So most of the modern machines will give you a diagram where it'll show you what stitch and then what foot to use ideally with that stitch. So the overcast one is quite a useful little one. So the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to construct a really simple seam. Let me see if there's any other questions. Cool. All right, so one little thing about having a universal machine that does both your neatening and your constructing is I've just left my machine on zigzag. So I try and remember when I'm kind of really in the making zone before I leave my machine to put it back to straight stitch, because the chances are I'm going to hop over, start stitching this seam, and I'm going to forget that I was on zigzag last time. So especially if you come back to your machine like the next day, it's a really good idea, good practice to finish neatening your seams and then go automatically straight back onto construction. Because the way that we would normally make things is we join fabric or pieces together, and then we neaten those seams once they're joined, and then we move on to pressing, and then we neaten the next, we stitch the next bunch of seams. Does that make sense? All right, so just going to show you another little gadget. Forgot to get this out. Okay, so we're going to go back to my machine, and I'm just going to pop this magnetic guide onto the 1.5. So technically I shouldn't really use one of these on the computerized machine, but I don't seem to have had too many problems. I'm still on zigzag, so I'm going to come back to my machine dials and go back to straight stitch, and then the length on this computerized machine automatically defaults to 2.2, which is too short for a joining seam. I want to come up to like 2.6. Okay, that's like my default on this machine. So I've set this little magnetic guide alongside my seam allowance, and my seam allowance in this example is 1.5. So I'm just going to construct this first little seam, and then we'll neaten this seam. So I always start maybe 1 centimetre in, and again I always hold my threads, particularly the needle thread, and drop my needle. That way, depending on the height of the needle when I finish, there's no chance of the top unthreading or the underneath one getting sucked in. And then I'm just going to do a couple of stitches back and not go right over the edge, and then carry my seam forward. So what I'm doing is I'm lining up this edge with this sort of stack of this magnet. Sometimes I use a stack of post-its, but having that little lip just makes it really easy to do your basic seam allowance, okay? You could put masking tape on, you could put washi tape, whatever you like, but I find the magnets really help when people are beginners. So we're coming all the way down this seam, just focusing here, and then when I get to the bottom, just like at the top, I don't want to go off and then backstitch. I'm going to backstitch a few stitches away from the edge and then run off, and that way I don't get a chewed up end. And then release that. So that's our basic simple seam, okay? 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So now we would be deciding, do we want a closed seam, which means we neaten the two flaps of seam allowance together, or do we want an open seam where we press this open and we neaten either side? So for a lot of dressmaking projects, this is the nicest seam, particularly if you've got thick fabric, because it creates a really flat seam. But for something like a cushion or a duvet cover that's going to be turned inside out, a closed seam is best, okay? So for my closed seam, I'd often trim this down to like halfway, so about 1 centimetre. So we're now going to look at neatening this seam. I'm going to neaten it closed, and I'm going to show you the method that is commonly taught in sort of vintage sewing books. In fact, first up I'm going to show you my approach. So I'm going to take my post-it, and I could use masking tape or anything like that, and this 1/8 guide is a really useful guide for running the raw edge of my seam against. So I'll be zigging in the fabric and zagging over the edge. So I'm going to just use that post-it note there. And again, you could put washi tape or masking tape permanently. So we're going to go back to our zigzag. On my machine, that's number 8. Then I'm going to do my settings again at 5 and 2. So the kind of standard overcasting settings. And then I'm going to slide this edge in line with my post-it. And you want to make sure that you get the fabric underneath this little hole. See that little hole where the needle goes? Just so that there's something for the feed dogs to grip onto. And then I'm just going to take my needle in. Now, most of the time we're going to be doing a joining seam above this. So don't worry too much about backstitching on your zigzag, because it often will create a jam. So just when you get started, don't worry about that. So we're going to just start sewing forward, and I'm focusing here. So can you see it zigging in and zagging over? Zigging to the left, zagging to the right. So I'm automatically going over that edge. So I'm going to stop halfway down, pull that out, and that is my seam neatened. So I'd probably give this a press. That might flatten some of that tunnelling where it's pulled over. Some of that may be that my machine is a little unhappy at the moment. So I'll show you what that would look like if I use my overcast foot. So on the same fabric, if I apply my overcast foot, like so. So what we've got is that little black blade that I showed you earlier, and that's going to run in line with the edge. So it doesn't hurt to have this in place as well. So your needle sort of gets caught a little bit in those brushes, that's fine. And I don't know if you can see on the camera, but there's sort of like a little finger. I'll show you on the foot in a minute. So exactly the same process. I'm just focusing this time on this little black kind of blade. And can you see that it is a little bit flatter? So it's less flat coming down the end, but it's definitely a bit flatter than the first half. So if we look there, our stitches look less squished up. So that's with the overcast foot. All right, so I'm going to go back to my normal foot, and I'm going to show you how this was taught to me and how it's taught in a lot of books and in some sewing patterns. So in a lot of kind of vintage instructions, it will tell you to do your zigzag in the middle of the seam. So you find some kind of focus. I'm just using this line here. And then you get your zigzag. Down like so. And release. Okay, and then the next step, and this is why it's not my method of choice, because the number of times I've done this and then I've seen students do this, we have to come in and trim just the outside of those stitches. So this is an extra process for every seam. Imagine you're making a really long dress, got all these really long seams, and you have to do this really carefully. And then again, I would always give this a press once I've stitched it. That's called under pressing, and it just stretches out your stitching. So even it's better to not get too close so that you've got a little bit of fraying. But I think that that's an awful lot more work than overcasting on the edge directly. Awesome. So we're going to take a little look now at doing the same thing with an open seam. So it's just very slightly different because you've got the seam allowance in the way and the seam in the way. Yeah, it can be mindful if you are doing your trimming. I just want to get on to the juicy stuff and do the interesting bits of the sewing, not just the neatening. So again, I didn't swap out of zigzag when I came to finish. So we're going to go back over to the machine, and I'm going to go back to my straight stitch. So I'm going back to stitch number 1, and then I need to reset my stitch length back up to 2.6. And then I'm using this guide here, so my 1.5 seam. Again, just lowering centimetre away from the edge, dropping in my needle and holding those tails, and then I do one stitch forward and then a little bit of a back stitch. So I'm just constructing the basic seam, and you can see nice and easy with the magnet. If you're happy doing it without, you can do without. A lot of beginners really struggle with this stage. So I normally use a smaller stack of post-its, but I don't have any. A stack of post-its. The downside of the post-its is that you have to keep replacing the bottom, so it isn't as environmentally friendly as a reusable magnet. But whatever works for you guys, okay? So I'm just making sure that I'm keeping my seam nicely lined up. Well, maybe not so nicely there. And a little bit of back stitching, but not on the edge, and then we're released. Okay, so we're back to where we started before. We've got our basic seam. Now, I don't have an iron set up, so I'm just going to thumb press this open. And then we're going to neaten this raw edge and then this raw edge. Now, when you come to do this, you want to make sure that you can still see this piece of seam allowance and the fabric. So what we don't want to do is to flip it like this, because you can't see what's going on underneath, and the chances are things could get bunched up. So you're always making sure that you've got the work to the left and that the seam allowance you're not neatening is kind of over to the left as well. Does that make sense, guys? I'll just flip it again. So we don't want to neaten this side first because we can't see what's going on underneath. We want to push that side over and then neaten this edge. So again, I'm just going to use a simple zigzag on this side. Let me go up to my zigzag. And I'm just using the standard setting. So again, I'm using my little post-it note. And I'm just using that as my guide. Now, if you don't want to mark up your machine, the way that I do this is I take my needle over to the right hand position and line that fabric up. And then you focus on, so maybe you won't have this 1/8 marked on your machine. So when the needle's in the right hand position on this machine, the fabric is butted against the needle and it lines up with this 1/8. If you don't have this little guide, this is where you might want to permanently mark your bobbin marker with a bit of masking tape. So needle's in the right hand position, and then we know that the fabric is just butted against, and wherever it sits here is your marker. Okay. So you see, we're just keeping this out of the way, and having it uppermost means we can see what it's doing. There we go. So again, it's a little bit twisty rolly. So this time on this side, we're going to take a look at doing half of it with the overcast foot. I do think some of that twisty rolly is that this machine is probably also a little bit unhappy. So these are snap-on, snap-off feet, so they're easy to interchange. It's still more work than I'd like to do, but, and then we're using that little black blade there as our guide. And again, you can even look at the front here. Fabric is just sitting inside that blade, and then there's two little fingers, a little bit like the overlocker, and they sort of keep the fabric flat. So you can see on this side, it looks a lot less bunchy than it did on that side. Let me just show you that on the camera. Can you see? It's not a massive difference, but it's enough to have this sit a bit flatter. So I could also use a different stitch, which is called an overcast stitch. So on this machine, this is number 11, and I'm going to show you this as a neatening, and then we'll look at it as a joining seam. So I'm going to go up to 11, and on my machine, it's setting the width to 7, and then the length to 2. Now, an overcasting stitch is doing 4 stitches for every 1 forward, so it's super slow, and you must use this overcasting foot. So again, we're lining up that edge, so it's going to do like a stitch forward zigzag, backwards, zigzag. And you see what I mean about it being much slower. So sort of hold the fabric lightly to the tension. But if you've got something that you're worried is going to fray, or maybe you're going to see inside, this is the closest you can get to an overlocker. But it will take you at least twice as long. And most machines, when on zigzag, try not to really put your foot down because that does cause more problems with fabric jamming. So when I release that, what you can see is it's a very different looking stitch. So it does a couple of sort of zigzags and it goes round the edge, and it also does a bit of a straight stitch in between. So it does give you the kind of finish of an overlocker. And if that's what you want inside, it does look quite nice. Then this is a nice alternative to using the simple zigzag. And then I think this machine, I'd have to have a little proper play, has got a couple of options for this overcasting. So you may find that you've got a better one that looks nicer on your machine. My previous machine had a nicer overcasting. What do we think about the overcasting stitch? So I think if it was something where you were going to see the finish of your seams, it would be worth using the overcasting stitch. If it's something that's going to be totally inside, it's so slow to do it that I probably wouldn't bother, but it's a nice alternative if you don't have an overlocker. One thing that the overcasting stitch can be good for is, let's say you are stitching stretch stuff and you don't have an overlocker and the zigzag isn't really cutting it, and you want a construction seam, and the you know, the lightning stitch, so you've tried all of those stitches but it's not really cutting it. You can actually join together stretchy fabrics with this overcasting stitch. So you've got to work out exactly where to place your needle, so it's in the left hand position for the seam allowance. If I wanted to, I've just got cotton to show you, but if I had a stretchy fabric, this is a good way of kind of joining things without an overlocker if you're finding that the zigzag is not really working for you, okay? Cool, so you like having the option of the overcasting. And again, I think as with all things sewing, think about what's going to happen to that seam. So if you're making, I don't know, let's say you're making a linen shirt, that it's a long line duster shirt that you plan to wear open, you may think, oh, I want to make sure those seams look a little bit nicer, and you don't have an overlocker, then it would be worth doing those with the overcasting stitch, because then they're going to sit really nice and flat and they're going to look a little bit more professional than just a zigzag. There are other ways that you could finish that if it's something that flips open, but for a really simple finish, I think that would be a great way to sort of make your seams look more overlocked. If that makes sense, guys? Okay, so we're going to now talk about using the overcasting to construct a seam. So again, this is probably really, I'd only normally do this for stretch, but I've just got some plain cotton. So we'll head back to the machine. I'll take away that little piece. So I've got my 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So I'm just going to line up my edge there. Okay, so probably the left has gone a little bit wide. What I would normally do ahead of time is to measure this. When it's in the left hand position, I think that's wider than 1.5. So I'm going to come in a little bit. So it's like 1.25 on the machine, so that I know that I'm stitching 1.5 from the edge. Does that make sense, guys? Because this is zigging further over when I line up this edge with the 1.5 guide. So you always need to take the left hand needle to the furthest position and measure it to make sure that you've got the right seam allowance or the seam guide. So again, if I'm joining, I'm just going to do a couple of stitches forward, although this one does backwards and then forwards. And then I am going to do a reverse stitch. Whoops. Okay, so it doesn't seem to like me doing the reverse stitch, so you may want to just have a little practice with your reverse stitches. And with this, I would probably try and keep each little section taut, really focus on where your guide is, because it goes backwards and forwards. So yeah, I wouldn't want to do every single garment like this because it's super slow, right? Okay, so that is the seam constructed, and you can see what this stitch actually looks like. So normally when it wraps around the edge, that little loopy thing is sort of hidden on the edge. So this is the only time that I would trim next to stitching, and I'm going to come this way. I like to be able to hold on to the bit I'm trimming and really carefully. It's better to have a few bits of thread or a bit of fabric beyond the stitching that will fray into nothing than cut this stitching. See what I mean? I'm not making myself go exactly next to it. I've just got a little millimetre beyond. And I just find if I'm holding on to the bit I'm trimming, it gives me a bit of an anchor. So that is a little bit like the overlocker. It's seamed and neatened all in one go. So that's joined it and it's neatened. So this is a really great alternative for sewing stretchy things, particularly say lycra, which can be problematic on the sewing machine. So that's just another little option for you guys. Okay, so that was everything that I was going to cover in our session today. So I hope that you found that useful for just your basic tips and trips for doing a neatening a seam. I hope that you've managed to get a couple of tips today that might help you speed up your neatening and might help you investigate possibly using your overcasting foot. I'm just going to very quickly, I'll show you a little bit more of a close-up again of this overcasting foot. So what we've got, and different brands, they look slightly different, but they'll always have something similar. Underneath we've got this little black blade, and that's where we guide our fabric. So the fabric sits inside of this little blade, and then we've got these two little kind of fingers, if you can see those. Bit like an overlocker, so you can see them better from the back. The zigzagging wraps around the fingers and they're flush with the fabric, keeping it all nice and flat, and then the brush just sort of keeps that edge in line. So it's quite a useful little foot, this overcasting foot, and hopefully, like I said, hopefully you'll have a little go and a little experiment, and hopefully I'll see you guys next week. Thank you so much for giving up your lunch break today. See you soon.